Welcome to Networking RX, a podcast devoted to helping business professionals like you enhance your networking skills in order to become more proficient giving and receiving quality business referrals and improving the overall quality of your life and the lives of those around you. The Networking RX podcast is a production of AmSpirit Business Connections, an organization whose mission is to empower business success through networking.
Welcome back. I'm Frank Agin, founder and president of AmSpirit Business Connections, and your host for this episode of the Networking RX podcast. Actually, I've been the host of every episode of the Networking RX podcast. Anyhow, I digress. Thanks again for listening, subscribing, and referring others. And certainly thank you to those who have sent in questions and comments. It's great. It helps me kind of continue on and come up with different material. I was communicating with somebody on LinkedIn, and obviously they're a listener because they kind of threw out a term that I use all the time at me. Just like you say, Frank, blah, 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 blah. I'm like, okay. It's not that nobody listens. At least one person listens. Anyhow, today is a guest day. Today I have on the program, just to back up for those who don't know, from time to time, it's just me talking about professional relationships and business networking. Other times I will have guests on, interesting people who can talk about business networking, people who can talk about professional relationships and how it all works together. And it really is kind of a broad field. At least I look at it that way. Not everybody looks at business networking from a broad perspective. But I just think there's so much to what happens to us, and it's not just getting out and shaking people's hands. A lot of times it's us just kind of dealing with ourselves and how we feel about ourselves, and how we feel about ourselves is certainly going to impact how we encounter other people or how we deal with other people. So today I have Dr. Laura Russell on with me. She is a associate professor of communication at the Denison University. Full disclosure, my daughter is a senior at Denison, and that's how I met Dr. Russell. I met Laura. I was having lunch one day with my daughter and kind of talking about all the different people that I was interviewing. And as you know, I've had other university professors on talking about their works. And she said, well, you need to talk to my professor, Dr. Russell. And I don't think Logan's got a class with you right now, does she?
No, actually,
Okay.
She and I never got to have class with one another. So, yeah.
So I'm not working for an A for my daughter, or whatever. Maybe just a B is she hoping for. This is totally, hey, this is a great opportunity. But as I indicated, Laura works at Denison University. For those who are not familiar, Denison University is a liberal arts college that's about 40 minutes east of Columbus, Ohio. Very good reputation. Sound like President Trump. Very great. Very good reputation, and had some notable graduates, including Steve Carell and of The Office fame, and Jennifer Gardner of the credit card commercials. So it's got a wonderful reputation. It's a top flight liberal arts college, and so I'm excited to have Laura on the program. She does a lot of things with respect to communication, and we'll certainly get into all of that. And she also works with a organization in Newark, Ohio, which is near Denison, Behavioral Health Partners, and helps does researches techniques for raising awareness and reducing the stigma around mental illness. So, Laura, welcome to the program. You know what, if you could kind of give us an overview of how you got to this point, who you are, what you do, what you got interested in it, your insights into the work you do with communication. And I do say communication without an S. I once spelled it with an S, and my daughter, it's not communications, Dad, it's communication. Okay, sorry. Anyhow.
Yeah, well, then she deserves her diploma. That is definitely a signature communication graduate right there. And when you ask where did it all begin and what has shaped me most profoundly, I go back to a story. And that story was when I was in high school. And at that time, I think I grew up rather shy and really enjoyed time alone, but I did not enjoy being intimidated by people. And so by nature, I think I was always curious how conversation happens because I didn't know how to make it happen. So one of the things I did when I was in my freshman year, I recognized halfway through that year, I don't want to continue living like this, because I would often look at the floor when I would walk along the hallways because I was scared of people and I was scared of talking. I didn't know how to do it. And so I said, every day, say hello to one person, just one, but get used to saying hello to someone new every day. And by golly, I did it. And slowly enough over time, that one started to multiply into more than one. And I then got excited when I could see that when saying something to somebody else sparked their energy. And so that only motivated me further, to the point that when I was in my senior year, I had assumed many leadership roles, and I still don't understand how, but ended up becoming the prom queen that we had, despite my, I did not like dances. That was one thing. So I think I had friends that lobbied for me to be on court just to get me there. But all that said, I was really inspired by how much people respond to being acknowledged. And I continued to have a curiosity in that when I went off to my college studies. So when I found communication, I not only found it liberating for a means to connect people, but as one who was always committed to well-being, and particularly recovery, as growing up in a household and seeing many family members fall to addiction, it was something that I grew up with but never fully understood. And so of all the medicines and all the treatments that we have, I think communication is such a valuable thing that you might even call it medicine in some cases for healing. So my trajectory since then has been on using communication as a means for health and well-being, and how do relationships with other people as well as relationships with ourselves facilitate really healthy outcomes.
Yeah, and I see this all really kind of playing into, into the things that I touch on, because certainly there are a lot of people out there who are in business who want to be in business, desperately want to be successful in business, are great, whatever they do, attorney, accountant, plumber, it doesn't matter, and just kind of being able to connect the dots, making connections with other people is a lot of times a stumbling block. Before, when we had spoke, when we first talked, you kind of came up with this notion in working with behavioral health partners, that people people need to be needed, I think was the notion. And and I want to kind of get you talking about that, because in networking we talk about giving to others and adding values to others, give. And what you've basically observed is that one of the best ways we can give to others is allow them to give to us. And for a lot of people, they're not comfortable with that.
Mm-hmm.
Some people, they're very comfortable with taking from everybody, but most people are just not comfortable with allowing people to give to us. But in a way, that's something that we can really offer somebody. So, I mean, if you kind of, how'd you stumble upon this observation that people need to be needed, and just kind of your insights on it?
Sure. And it was, I would love to think it's a novel discovery. I think by default, a lot of us have been able to come across that, but often stumble into it. And, I think a lot of us even might say receiving compliments from others can be hard, because our culture is becoming grounded upon this very active being. And part of that being active and being a good citizen is to give. And so I think that that's an ethic that we embody sometimes unknowingly, until we have moments where we sit as a receiver and find that uncomfortable. So I came across this initially because I was interviewing several people about their experiences with recovery, particularly people who had been able to sustain recovery for quite a long time. And so part of that research was what makes that happen? Because as anyone in the field of recovery and addiction knows, relapse is almost far more common than a sustained recovery. So what is it that certain individuals have, or what resources do they have access to that allows for them to continue on? And I noticed a couple things during those interviews. One was when I asked individuals what was their secret, seeing how they lit up, just even in the conversation about having something to say about their story, was eye-opening enough. I also witnessed this because I would say to them, if I were struggling, what would you offer me? And that was a better way to frame a question than to say, how has your recovery continued? Because you ask most people that, they don't know, right? Like, there's a lot of things that figure into that. But when you say, what would you advise me as one struggling with this? They suddenly have this very cogent ability to offer something really meaningful. I mean, some people even illustrated diagrams for me and showed this, and their energy came alive.
So it's not so much the substance of what they said, but it's the fact that you're just asking them to provide their opinion.
Yeah.
Give me the value of your, there's value to what you have to say.
There's value to what you have to say, and acknowledging that. And having visited many of the recovery treatment programs, I saw how instructional they were, and how the people who were struggling with the addictions were in a very passive role, where they were being told what to think and how to fix their lives. And I've seen such contrast between how people behave when they're regarded as having something value to contribute. And I think a lot of my underlying interpretations for this come from some scholars that I've drawn from. I think many people might be familiar with Carl Rogers. He's a psychologist that was one of the first to take a really humanistic, and he called it person-centered approach. And saying that our therapeutic relationships need to be more two-way than one-way, that in order for people to feel like they have value, they need to be able to give that value, to know that it's there. And so far too often, I think we're concerned with telling people things without recognizing they do have something valuable, and they have to realize that before they can even begin taking action. If you don't feel capable of taking action, if you're always receiving, then you're really putting someone in a difficult position. So I think about how that translates in other spheres, because as a professor, I've now had to be really reflective about how I practice my advising and my teaching, because I'm seeing, if I'm always in the role of instruction, when am I giving my students the opportunity to really see themselves as mattering, as having something valuable to give, to share? In my advising sessions in particular, I've started to notice, and this is probably all anecdotal evidence in my personal life with my interactions with students, but I have shifted the way that I advise, because I thought, how many questions do I ask my students when they're with me? If I looked at the ratio between questions I give them to respond versus things I tell them what to do or to think about, sometimes it's very embarrassing because the ratio is just completely not equally distributed. So it's been a challenge for me, but a good one, because I see the difference just immediately in their embodied appearance to me. But then over time, throughout semesters, they'll come back and they'll say they've built on this. They've been able to grow in ways that I've just been really inspired by. And I've been challenged to become a better receiver and a better acknowledger than so much a giver and speaker. So that's shifted the way that I practice in my teaching. It's also shifted how I've tried to conceptualize what recovery is, and continuing to work with recovery programs as well, and thinking about what really benefits people most. What do they need? What do they need most? And I think we can point out needs on the surface, but whether it's in business, whether it's in teaching, whether it's in recovery, we're all human beings at the end of the day. And it's amazing how we all have very similar needs.
Yeah.
And they're not numbered. I mean, there are very few basic needs that we have that will drive the course of our life. And I would argue very strongly that one of those is to be needed in the world. We all want that in some way.
Yeah, it's interesting you talk about that, because I have a daughter who's a senior in college, and a son who's out working, and another son who's he's a sophomore, but pretty independent. And as a parent, you kind of go through that period where it's like, okay, now what?
Yeah.
I've spent however many years caring for human beings, and now it's not that I have nothing in my life. Don't get me wrong. And I think a lot of people kind of look forward to this time, but for me, it's like, I'm not as needed, and which is a good thing, right? That's a good thing, but it does kind of leave a hole in your life.
Yeah, it does. And it's interesting that, like you said, it applies to parenting too. It goes across all these contexts. Yeah.
Well, I have a lot of other things going on in my life, so it's not that big of a hole. I mean, it is a hole, but I can see somebody who, with less, not feeling that sense of being needed would be more critical. It's a greater percentage of their total being. Are you trying to test for these things, or is it mainly just observations to this point? Are there plans to do some sort of field test, or not, I would say classroom, but something more controlled on campus? I don't know what the term for it would be.
I would love, I think as I'm thinking about wanting to test it, a couple of things come to mind for me. And one is definitely redesigning recovery programs.
Okay.
That's where my hunch began. I'm seeing it in a lot of different spheres beyond that, but because of my volunteer work right now with behavioral healthcare partners, there's such a need there. And so I've wanted to be able to respond to that. My research matters to me, but more important are the ways that it can be applied, because I'm an applied researcher at heart. So working with them to say, what are some different communicative practices, not just the content, but just how we actually interact with people in this environment? How can that change? That's
Right.
not been something that's hugely studied. Oftentimes it is the content or the structure of the program, but not the actual practice of communicating. So that's one area that I want to look at. There's another thing, just even in my environment at the university, we have advising circles with students. And I would love to think about those as spaces to create a more collaborative way of communicating therein, with students being able to offer other students ideas and developing this sense of being a receiver and what that means. I would say that's where before I can implement a lot more, I do also want to do more theoretical work to understand how do we conceptualize what it means to be a receiver, especially in our current social world, where even with, I would say, social media and the many ways that we've been conditioned to be responders, to be speakers, to be tellers, tell your story, promote yourself.
Right.
There's a lot of outward communication. And you think it goes back to one of the sayings is everyone is talking, who's listening, right?
Yeah. It's the hey me society. Look at me, look at me.
Yeah. So I think that I'm not excited about some of the conditions of where our culture is going, but also I think there's a lot of awesome changes happening too. Like with every form of disadvantage, there's advantages being created equally at the same time. So I'd rather look at the glass as half full here and say, what kinds of opportunities are afforded to us now that we have all these different ways of communicating?
Well, I think Yeah, with social media, I think people have just kind of come to the realization, hey, I have a mouthpiece here. I have a mouthpiece and people will listen. And eventually they realize that really the power here is that I have an earpiece and I can listen to other people. So, I mean, I think that's great. You know, you're trying to implement results. I mean, some researchers I talk to, they're simply reporting it. This is what I found. Let somebody else try and implement it. Have you stumbled across any either anomalies, a situation where kind of people needing to be needed didn't really work, or maybe surprises? And that, I guess that could be two different spectrums. I look at surprises as, wow, that worked really well, and anomalies like that just kind of went totally haywire.
Yeah, there's certainly anomalies. And I would say one of the first that comes to mind is knowing the right questions to ask. Even as receivers, and I would say this might be in the role, I'm thinking of business contexts, where the role of the leader is to know how to ask the right questions. And that is one of the hardest things, I think, because you can't plan always what questions you're going to ask. You have to be very immediate with the moment and know where to go with that. And so for me, I've definitely encountered challenges when I've spoken with other people, and I am mindful, okay, I need to ask something, but I don't know exactly what's going to be the right key to open this person up, to help them get to a place where they feel like they can even say something. I think that that's one of the biggest roadblocks you can encounter. Ideally, someone will always have something to say, but that's not always the case. And then I've also had experiences where when people do have something to share, it's not good. So then there's more of a ruminating effect, which means that they're kind of dwelling on something not good, and you can see the energy even going further and further, and you think you got to rescue that, right? So there are cases that people need to be needed, but people also have needs, and they need us. So knowing when is the right time for what is complicated. It sounds so much more easy to just talk it out and play it out theoretically. But in practice, because people are so diverse, there's not a formula for it.
No, I mean, I often say with respect to social scientists have it much harder than the other science, the physical sciences, because, when you mix two chemicals under the same conditions, you get the same result again and again and again, right? It's very predictable, makes it easy. With the things that you're talking about and other social scientists talk about, things can change. They can turn on a dime. In other words, you have a conversation with somebody one day and you're getting a certain result, and then the very next day, same person, same question, it's something totally different, and it's some other variable in their life that you can't even see or don't know about, or they might not even know about, changes everything. And that's why they look at these social. I've heard these reports about, we can't duplicate these social science tests, this research. Well, it doesn't mean it's fraudulent. It just means that there's just, things are different. Every day is different, and people approach things differently. When the economy's booming, people are going to react differently than when the economy's down, and so. And you got a hard job there.
You do. I think another hard part about it, and this may be more one that is just a personal thing, but sometimes when I've been in larger groups and I've seen a need to stimulate conversation, this often happens in some of my church settings when we have studies together. I'll raise a question, but people misinterpret the question when you're trying to generate, contributions from everybody, that you're the one who doesn't know anything. And so suddenly, as a question asker, you become the case to fix, which is not what you intended with your question. But that can happen too. And I'm sure that frustrates people, and it may keep people from asking questions to begin with because they don't want to be seen as the person who doesn't know. The whole other vault of challenges I think we encounter when we're communicating, how much our identities are coming out in that, and how when we ask questions, they can be interpreted a lot of ways. And sometimes once it's out there, you have no control over where it's going to go or what it's going to do or how people are going to respond. So I will say I've had frustrating occasions too, just in daily practice,
Yeah.
with how do questions get taken up and responded to in ways that we hope for them to. So,
Right.
yeah.
So what's on the horizon? I mean, are there different aspects of this you want to look into, or right now you've got plenty on your plate to really kind of peel away at this?
There's a lot of different aspects I want to look into, and obviously what I've previously mentioned about the ways of seeking to apply this and then study it through the application would be a goal. But another thing that I think I'm really interested in, I've always been fascinated with virtues, and seeing how virtues come into play with how we take on the role, say, of a receiver or a questioner or of someone who cares, or when we're giving, what is it that we're giving? Because I think giving a listening ear is a form of giving. It's just a different form.
Right.
So I do want to better understand what is it at the heart of our interest in being givers, what could be at the heart of being a receiver. And so I have taken interest in gratitude and have actually read a lot about Stoic living and going back to the ancient philosophies, right, about what constitutes a good life. And in gratitude, it's amazing how you see so much more in the world. With a grateful eye, you recognize value, whereas value doesn't just stand on its own, right? We
Right.
have to give something value. And part of the way we do that is through being grateful. I think that gratitude plays a huge role in how we encounter other people. Because if we look at every human being that we come across and recognize that they have a world that they've lived in and a whole lot to share, no matter who they are, then think about how excited we'd be to want to know more about them, to want to know more about that world. So I would say in the horizons, I definitely want to look at this more as a beyond just this context of health or this context of teaching, just the everyday being of a person, and what does it take to become someone who's really invested in another and in a way that can position them to really empower people. I also think that this has undertones of transformative leadership. And if you're familiar with that model of transformative leadership, it's how a leader empowers those that they're leading to really take lead.
Right.
And that's why it's transformative, because you're really trying to create fellow leaders, and in a way that if you took the leader out of the equation, the system would run fine, right? That's a sign of a good leader. So I would also like to see this in really looking into leadership work and finding out how do you cultivate this sense of gratitude or a gracious life into positions where you are working a lot with other people, and in a way that you can make a powerful difference.
We have a listening audience. How could they help you? How could they support you? Are there just stay tuned kind of a thing, or?
That's such a good question, not knowing who's listening, right? Because there's so
Yeah.
many people that listen in different ways. And I would say, first of all, I would love for listeners to practice this
Yeah.
in an everyday sort of way. How many questions versus how many statements do you make, right? And
Yeah.
it's a good exercise for us all when we're with people. And I know for me, I have many days that I don't succeed in the ways that I wish I would have. And I'll go back and I'll think, I wish I would have asked. I wish I would have da-da-da-da. But I would love for people to try to embrace that. I would also, in that practical way, really question why in some moments receiving can be difficult, right?
Yeah.
So allowing yourself to be a receiver, and what does it feel like, or allowing someone else to be the one who's fulfilling the needs. Why is that challenging? Can we resist that? As far as other needs go, though, with connecting with this, I would love for listeners to be thinking and perhaps working with me on how can we develop this as an ethic in a world that I think, as I mentioned, I'm excited by many of the opportunities right now that we have, but I'm also concerned about the emphasis on the self as opposed to the other. And the self is constituted by others. Sometimes we forget that. And we need other people. And therefore, those other people need us too. How can we be thinking about this as being receptive as a form of being active? How can we transform that? How can we create messages for the public to embrace that kind of mindset in a way that is more giving towards other people, that allows for them to see good in themselves? If we were all looking out for each other, we wouldn't need to look out for ourselves. I realize it's very utopian, right? And I don't think we'll ever reach that point, especially where we're at right now in our world. But if we began to think that way, I would love to see the good outcomes that might follow from that.
Yeah. Well, I really appreciate your time today, Laura. This is great. Dr. Laura Russell with Denison University. Thanks for your time today.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining us on the Networking RX podcast. Please put what you've learned into action today and let us know if you have questions, comments, or ideas for future topics. You can email them to us at podcast@amspirit.com. That's AmSpirit.com. Finally, so you never miss an episode, be sure to subscribe to the Networking RX podcast through iTunes, Overcast, or however you receive your podcasts. Now get out and network with someone.
The Networking RX podcast is the copyright production of AmSpirit Business Connections. All rights reserved.